Hello and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television, the program that takes you around the globe in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Shoboale. On the program this week, we focus on the political crisis in Mali, plus ongoing unrest over the disputed presidential elections in Belarus and the situation in Lebanon after the explosion in Beirut. In Mali, the political crisis has taken a turn for the worse after Mali's president Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta resigned on August 19th, hours after soldiers seized him from his home following months of mass protest against alleged corruption and worsening security situation in the West African country. The military leaders, calling itself the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, say they acted to prevent the country from falling further into chaos and will set up a transitional government ahead of new elections.
J'ai eu le bonheur.
From disputed elections to the president's detention, Mali's President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta has resigned and dissolved parliament. The move came hours after mutinying soldiers detained him, along with Prime Minister Boubou Cissé and other top officials. Keïta announced his decision to step down in a brief address on national broadcaster ORTM at about midnight.
Des efforts fabuleux qu'il fallait mettre en œuvre.
After weeks of turbulence of various demonstrations, it pleased some elements of our armed forces to conclude that it should end with their intervention. So I don't really have a choice, because I did not wish for blood to be spilled to keep me in office. This is why I wish right now, while thanking the people of Mali for joining me throughout these long years with warmth and affection, to announce my decision to retire from this moment, with all the consequences, the dissolution of the National Assembly and the government.
The news of Keïta's departure was met with jubilation by anti-government demonstrators, while leaders of the military coup, calling themselves the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, say they will enact a political transition and stage elections within a reasonable time.
Le Mali sombre de jour en jour dans le chaos.
In order to avoid the country from sinking, patriotic forces gathered at the National Committee for the People's Salvation have decided to take responsibility before the people and history to ensure the continuity of the state and public services. This heavy responsibility will only be achieved by the living forces of this nation. From August the 19th, 2020, all aerial and land borders will be closed until further notice. A curfew will be in place until further notice from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m. The continuity of public services will be ensured by those entitled with rules in effect. Civil society and political movements are invited to join us so we can create together the best conditions for civilian political transition, leading to credible regional elections that ensure democracy through a roadmap that will lead to a new Mali.
The political upheavals unfold months after disputed legislative elections and came as support for Keïta tumbled amidst criticisms of his government's handling of a sprawling security situation in the north and central regions that has entangled regional and international governments, as well as the United Nations mission. Amidst growing protests, regional mediators from ECOWAS had tried to breach the impasse between Keïta's government and opposition leaders.
D'essayer de redresser ce pays.
Keïta tried to meet protesters' demands through a series of concessions and even said that he was open to redoing disputed legislative elections. But those overtures were swiftly rejected by opposition leaders who said they would not stop short of Keïta's resignation. The downfall of Keïta, who was first elected in 2013, and returned to office 5 years later, closely mirrors that of his predecessor, Amadou Toumani Touré, who was forced out of the presidency in a coup in 2012 after a series of punishing military defects. That time, the attacks were carried out by ethnic Tuareg separatist rebels.
To another country facing political unrest, Belarus's President Alexander Lukashenko is coming under increasing pressure as demonstrations sparked by a disputed presidential election show no signs of abating, with more factory workers joining the protest.
Outside the Minsk prison, where activist blogger Sergei Tikhanovsky has been held since being barred from standing against Lukashenko in the presidential elections, supporters gathered to wish him well on his 42nd birthday on August 18th.
The August 9th elections were neither fair nor transparent.
Ahead of the August 9th presidential election, Tikhanovskaya's wife, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, stepped in to replace her husband shortly after the announcement of election results in which the government said Lukashenko had won a resounding victory. She was forced to flee the country. Initially, she appeared to concede defeat, but has since called for international mediation to break the deadlock.
Honorable leaders of Europe, I call on you to support the awakening of Belarus. I call on all countries to respect the principles of international law. I call to respect the sovereignty of Belarus and the choice of Belarusian people.
Workers across Belarus have downed tools after the country's opposition called for a nationwide strike. Staff at the country's state broadcaster have also walked off the job in support of mass protests. Hundreds of protesters have been wounded and 2 have died in clashes with police over the past week. Some 6,700 people have also been arrested, and many have spoken of torture at the hands of security forces.
President Lukashenko initially dismissed the idea of new elections, but as international pressure mounts, he appears to have backpedaled, calling for constitutional changes. However, Belarus's closest ally, Russia, has called on the international community to stop interfering.
President Alexander Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus since 1994, has announced that new elections could be held after Belarus adopts a new constitution, hours after telling a crowd of striking workers that elections will not be held, quote, unless you kill me. The latest remarks mark a major change for Lukashenko, who has so far defied calls to give up power amid mass protests. Foreign governments have heaped further scrutiny on the longtime leader, joining calls for a fresh vote and condemning apparent human rights violations in the aftermath of the election. European Union leaders met in an emergency summit on 19th of August, during which they endorsed sanctions on Belarusian officials blamed for the election fraud.
Our message is very clear. Stop the violence, and we don't accept the impunity. We don't tolerate the impunity, and that's why we took this very important decision. It's our intention to decide sanctions, targeted sanctions, in order to target the individuals, authorities involved in the process of violence or in the falsification of the elections.
In reaction, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko told Western countries not to nod at Belarus and concentrate on their own problems. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he had spoken with German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron in separate phone calls, informing them that putting pressure on the government in Minsk was unacceptable. Russia, a close ally to Belarus, says there's no need for outside mediation over the unrest in Belarus and accused foreign powers of using the crisis to interfere in the country. Meanwhile, hundreds of Minsk residents have continued to rally in support of Belarusian President Lukashenko. Waving Belarusian flags, Lukashenko supporters chanted his name and held up posters, some reading, "Lukashenko, move forward, people are with you."
Over in Lebanon, 1 of 4 men accused of killing former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in Beirut in 2005 has been convicted by a special UN-backed court.
The Special Tribunal for Lebanon, STL, an international court based near The Hague, Netherlands, found Salim Ayash guilty of conspiracy to commit a terrorist act, murdering Hariri, murdering 21 others, and attempting to murder 226 more in the suicide car bombing on February 14th more than 15 years ago. There was insufficient evidence against 3 other men charged as accomplices in the bombing, and they were acquitted.
The trial chamber, therefore, finds Salim Jamil Ayash guilty as a co-perpetrator of Count 1, conspiracy aimed at committing a terrorist act, Count 2, committing a terrorist act by means of an explosive device, Count 3, intentional homicide of Rafiq Hariri with premeditation by using explosive materials, Count 4, intentional homicide of 21 persons in addition to the intentional homicide of Rafiq Hariri with premeditation by using explosive materials.
The 4 men accused are members of the Iran-backed militia and political party Hezbollah, although the group was not formally charged and denied any involvement. Hariri, a Sunni Muslim billionaire, had close ties with the United States, Western and Sunni Gulf Arab allies, and was seen as a threat to Iran and Syrian influence in Lebanon. He led efforts to rebuild Beirut following the 1975 to 1990 civil war. Hariri's son, Saad, who is himself a former prime minister, says he accepts the verdict, but that he had expected more information to emerge from the trial.
We had, like many presidents and many former prime ministers, were killed either in office or outside office, and we never had any truth of what happened. I think today's, everybody's expectation was much higher than what came out, but I believe that the tribunal came out with a result that is satisfying. We accept it, and we believe that there are still a lot of issues unknown.
Ayash's sentence will be handed down at a later date. The UN-backed court has no death penalty, and maximum jail sentences are life imprisonment.
The long-awaited verdict comes at a precarious time for Lebanon. It was delayed by the devastating blast in Beirut on August 4th, which led to the resignation of the government, already embattled by months of protest over the collapse in currency and high unemployment. Over 2 weeks on, residents are still trying to rebuild their shattered lives.
It felt like an eternity rather than just a few minutes as haute couture fashion designer Eli Saab scrambled to make sure his 200 staff members, including his son, were safe when this month's massive explosion shook Beirut.
I saw my son covered in blood. I could not believe it. It was 15 minutes that felt like 2 days long.
The explosion killed 178, injured 6,000 and damaged whole neighborhoods. Saab says that his main office and headquarters were badly damaged. His home, a few hundred meters from the port, was gutted. Resilient, he says, giving up is not an option.
The Lebanese are defiant. We must go on. That is a doable part. But the biggest loss is the people you can't bring back.
Saab is no stranger to devastation. He started his label in 1982 at the height of Lebanon's 1975 to 1990 civil war. The August 4th blast revived those memories.
It was the same smell, the same dust, the broken glass. Honestly, we did not want to relieve this, and it was not necessary.
Another group accustomed to the devastation of war are Syrian refugees who have sought safety in Lebanon from their own war-ravaged homeland. In the aftermath of the explosion, refugees relying on food aid and menial labor jobs are desperately struggling to keep afloat. According to the UNHCR, at least 34 refugees died in the explosion. Lebanon has been host to more than 1 million refugees from neighboring Syria since the civil war there began in 2011. Officials have blamed the explosion on ammonium nitrate stored unsafely at the port. But for many Lebanese, they say that it was just the latest neglect by a sectarian elite that has for decades now failed to provide the most basic services like electricity.
Welcome back. More than 150 vaccines are being developed and tested around the world to stop the COVID-19 pandemic, which has killed hundreds of thousands and ravaged the global economy. As the race for a COVID-19 vaccine continues, the head of the World Health Organization says the pandemic is being worsened by countries putting their own interest ahead of others in trying to secure supplies of a possible COVID-19 vaccine.
The WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros.
The World Health Organization's Director General has issued another warning against vaccine nationalism, saying nations that hoard possible COVID-19 vaccines while excluding others will deepen the pandemic. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus says without vaccinating the highest risk populations around the world, all at the same time, it would be impossible to rebuild the global economy.
While there is a wish amongst leaders to protect their own people first, the response to this pandemic has to be collective. This is not charity. We have learned the hard way that the fastest way to end this pandemic and to reopen economies is to start by protecting the highest risk populations everywhere, rather than the entire populations of just some countries. Sharing finite supply strategically and globally is actually in each country's national interest. No one is safe until everyone is safe.
Researchers and pharmaceutical giants around the world are racing to produce a vaccine, with 9 of the 29 currently being tested on humans, forming part of the shared COVAX Global Vaccines Facility. Some 92 countries are signed up to COVAX, while a further 80 have expressed interest, but are yet to come fully on board. The UN agency says it has an August 31st deadline for wealthier nations to join the COVAX Global Vaccines Facility for sharing vaccine hopefuls with developing countries.
The COVAX Global Vaccines Facility is the critical mechanism for joint procurement and pooling risk across multiple vaccines, which is why today I sent a letter to every member state encouraging them to join the COVAX facility.
Dr. Tedros says the most of the exposed 20% of each country's population, including adults over 65 and those with pre-existing conditions, would be targeted in the first wave of vaccinations once the WHO spearheaded and shared facility can roll out a proven and effective vaccine.
The WHO's push for nations to join COVAX comes as the European Union, Britain, Switzerland and the United States strike deals with companies testing prospective vaccines. Public officials worldwide have stressed that the pandemic likely will not end until there is an effective vaccine. Even after a vaccine is approved, they say there remains the tremendous challenge of producing enough of it for the world's population. Russia says its Sputnik vaccine, the first to be approved and produced, will be rolled out by the end of August. However, some scientists say they fear Moscow may be putting national prestige before safety.
Moscow's decision to approve its vaccine and produce the first batches after less than 2 months of human testing has raised concerns among some scientists. But Russian officials have dismissed those concerns as simply Western jealousy. The vaccine is dubbed Sputnik 5, in a nod to the Soviet Union's launch of the world's first satellite sent into space in 1957. The vaccine, developed by the Gamaleya Research Institute in coordination with the Russian Defense Ministry, was given regulatory approval without being put through final phase 3 in human trials. While numerous experts and governments have raised concerns that Russia is racing to be the first with an approved vaccine and compromising safety, some countries have shown interest in Sputnik 5. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro say they would volunteer to be among the first to be vaccinated. Meanwhile, the Philippines plans to start trialing the vaccine in October, with President Rodrigo Duterte expected to be inoculated as early as May next year. A Brazilian technology institute says it is expected to produce the vaccine by the second half of 2021, shortly after the state of Parana signed a memorandum of understanding with Moscow. Russian officials say the vaccine will be gradually rolled out to high-risk people, including frontline workers, by the end of this month, before a mass vaccination of Russians begins in October. The vaccine will then be made available to other countries around November.
The international high-stakes vaccine race took a turn when Russia announced the first coronavirus vaccine cleared for use. But amid concerns over Russia's vaccine, China is pushing ahead with efforts with a promise that for Beijing's vaccine candidate, safety comes first.
China says researchers are keeping safety in mind when they develop and thoroughly test a COVID-19 vaccine because it will be used on healthy people. Scientists are trying their best to minimize any potential risks that may crop up through careful observation and tests.
The vaccine is used for healthy people, so safety comes first. For ordinary medicine, the four sequential conditions are effectiveness, safety, controllable quality, and feasibility for mass production. However, for a vaccine, the sequence is different. Safety first and effectiveness second.
China has granted its first COVID-19 vaccine patent to the adenovirus vector vaccine developed by Chen and the Chinese biotech company CanSino Biologics. The patent application was submitted on March 18 and approved on August 11. The vaccine, dubbed AD5-nCoV, uses a weakened common cold virus to introduce genetic material from the novel coronavirus into the human body. The goal is to train the body to produce antibodies that recognize the virus's protein spike and be able to fight it off. Authorities perform the clinical trial step by step by injecting the minimum required dosage of the vaccine to the fewest volunteers at first and observe the volunteers for any side effects. Meanwhile, people in Indonesia are joining phase 3 trials for a potential coronavirus vaccine developed by Chinese company Sinovac Biotech. The World Health Organization last week confirmed 6 vaccine candidates in late-stage trials. 3 of them are from China. Another Chinese vaccine candidate developed by China National Pharmaceutical Group, Sinopharm, has started its late-stage testing in the United Arab Emirates. With 15,000 volunteers, aside from China, more than 150 other candidate vaccines are currently being developed and tested around the world. Developers including Britain's AstraZeneca plc, the University of Oxford's partner, and US biotech company Moderna Incorporated are in final stage trials involving tens of thousands of people.
And finally, on Foreign Dispatches today, from COVID-19 to migrants, a Colombian craftivist uses clay to make a statement. Take a look.
Colombian craftivist Edgar Alvarez is making a statement in Bogota using his plastic artwork to raise awareness for those suffering during the pandemic and the situation of millions of Venezuelan migrants that have sought a new life abroad.
This pandemic has changed us, so it is essential to be able to depict them. And that is where I come in to explain with clay plasticine. It is precisely that, to bring a clear message to people, and that's how it works. With clay plasticine, it is easier to explain certain issues.
Alvarez's crafticism has gone global with hundreds of thousands of fans on Facebook and Twitter in his It's Explained Through Clay pages. His 2015 claymation entitled Los Invisibles touched on the problem of homelessness in the U.S. city of Los Angeles. With the world gripped by the pandemic, Alvarez hopes his work can provide an animated lesson for some of the world's most pressing issues.
And that's Foreign Dispatches today. Don't forget that you can catch up with all our top stories on channelstv.com. Thanks for watching. I'm Teniola Shobowale. See you next time.